Welcome everyone to another Voices with Vervaeke. So I'm here with Rich from Blundell, and he reached out to me not that long ago with a very interesting email, and he said, "Hey John, your work and my work are convergent in a lot of ways." And then we met and we talked, and I was really impressed that Rich isn't just bringing in a very powerful theoretical framework, which he does have, and I'm sure he'll talk about this. But there's two other things that I want Rich to talk about, and I think are valuable for everybody. One, Rich has an ongoing actual project working at the level of distributed cognition as well as individual cognition to try and bring about transformation. So he's very much, and this is only half of the joke, he's very much like me trying to save the world. And so that is something we share. And as grandiose and perhaps as hubristic as that might be, it does not seem that there's any other morally responsible alternative right now. And then the other dimension, which will be a little bit more nuanced, and Rich and I will have to help each other dialogically. But when I was talking to Rich, there's a spiritual dimension to this. Rich has a participatory connection to what he's talking about. This is something that and again, I don't use these terms. I try to use these terms very carefully, but there's a properly, I would describe it almost as mystical, properly understood aspect to what he's doing, and there's connections between the way it reaches from the depths of him to the depths of the world, and that is, empowers and motivates him to engage in the project in a way that just theoretical belief wouldn't, and I think that's very, very important. There's that extra dimension that I think is very, very important for, the meaning crisis and the meta crisis. So very, very pleased to have you here, Rich. Why don't you say a bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and why you approached me, and then, about maybe those two dimensions, the project, the projects you're engaged in, and again, the way in which you decided not to pursue this just academically, but in a more participatory, transformative fashion.
Sure, thanks, John. But so let me just address that first thing, which is why I reached out to you in the first place. It's because I deeply respect you and your work. Yeah. And I mean, as a scholar, and I've had the privilege and the opportunity to really listen to you. And, at every turn, you are just, you are a true scholar, and I admire and I respect the rigor that you bring to this in that sense. But then there's also this other side of you that's really willing to engage, with ideas that are outside of your discipline and people that are, that may be sort of outliers and things like that. But I think those two things actually go together. It's your scholarship actually enables your deep and rigorous scholarship gives you that sort of permission to look wider. I mean, I think yeah. No, I mean that though, but the former really enables the latter in that sense. Right. So thank you. And for all that you're doing. And I also see you being very much, a participant observer in a lot of this stuff. I see you trying things out, experimenting, and putting yourself in front of these things. So I don't know, it's just, I deeply respect that. So thank you. This other thing about when you were sort of introducing me, you're talking about the spiritual dimensions of this. I find that deeply paradoxical because I have absolutely no experience, no training, I haven't done any sort of research in any of the spiritual traditions. My only source really of, propositional knowledge is science. And so I find it deeply paradoxical that I can't, it's an inescapable sometimes to speak in spiritual terms. And I find it uncomfortable, but unavoidable. And so I struggle with that.
Right, as do I. So I thank you for being honest about that.
Well, okay. And so the other reason that the main reason that I reached out to you is because I thought you would be a good person to, there is this practice that I call Oika, which is actually, it's much more than a practice. I mean, we can talk about it as a practice, but it really is a life world. It's a way of being in the world.
Right.
And so I was hoping to sort of present it to you as a proposal,
Yes.
and then see if you thought it sufficed as a candidate for a psychotechnology. I get the sense that it might.
Yeah.
And I thought you'd be a good person to sort of so that if I could get you to understand what it is, the sort of the contours of it, and then we could really sort of deconstruct it and interrogate it in some sense to see if how it works.
Yeah, and that might help shed light on that paradox you just put your finger on a few minutes ago too.
Yeah.
Why we are called to talk about it in a certain way, called from within scientific language, nevertheless to speak of a way that's not traditionally thought of as scientific. So first of all, why the term oika? The ancient Greek term for the household. It's at the base of the word economics, right? Were you picking up on those associations?
I am. I mean, the Greek term oikos is where it sort of is grounded. I kind of invented the word based on that idea of home, but in the ancient Greek conception, oikos, it was more about, home was this sort of this synthesis of the person, and the person being the man, and the house.
Right.
So the man of the house, and then all of the sort of material things that are in the house, which is what oikos sort of refers to as this collective sense of home. And I kind of wanted to expand that out, maybe make it more inclusive and less patriarchal in a sense.
Of course.
And that's where the term oika comes from. And you're right. So it's more sort of a feminized, version of oiko.
Right.
And the other thing is that I forgot what I was going to say, but that it's not only the root of the term eco as in economics, it's also the root of the term eco as in ecology, which I think is really profound, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, so you're pointing to like a common connection or a common source of both of those?
Source, in a way of sort of reintegrating and recoupling those two ideas, which is, we could maybe get to that later, but there is a part of what I do that is directly trying to recouple economic and ecologic concerns using like crypto, blockchain philosophy, that kind of thing. Right. We can talk about that later. But the reason I even know about what Oikos is because I've trained as an ecologist. That's my fundamental background, is as an ecologist. I started in geology and ecology, did a lot of marine sciences, that kind of thing, evolutionary dynamics. Then I got into the history and philosophy of science. So I ended up doing a master's degree, which was kind of a deep dive into the philosophy of science, I think the most valuable thing I got from that was not to see how powerful science is, but how limited it is. How really to claim something being scientific, it creates this real constraint on what it is that it can be. If you're going to call it scientific, at least in my perspective, kind of old school, that science has a methodology, and it's falsifiable, and it's reproducible, and it's it has all these sort of controls, and it's stated in terms of probabilities, all of these things that make science. And so we tend to but that was the real highlight there, was that I realized, boy, science is really limited in what we can say, actually. And there's so much more to the complexity and the nuance of the world that is in some sense out of the reach of science. Maybe not in principle, but at least in practice, it's currently, unavailable to us. So, and then I ended my sort of academic training in a new and emerging field called big history, which is also sometimes called deep history, which is essentially the story of the universe, the whole cosmos, presented and studied in a way that actually includes the human history. So it's cosmic history, it's natural history, it's human history, it's history, but it's all history as a kind of integrated narrative.
So it's got deep time.
It's sort of based on deep time, but and there's a lot of challenges, and there's a lot of, the field is still having a lot of growing pains. It's really trying to sort of figure out what it is. But it was the only discipline, if you can call it that, that could really contain my curiosity about the world. I was sort of on a mission back then to understand what this is. Like it was one of the, this fundamental question of what is this? Like this thing that we all are living and sharing in. What is this? And big histories was the only, scholarly way to really even think about approaching, understanding that question. What is this? What is reality?
So who are some names in this field? I don't know. Is Sean Carroll an example of this with the big picture book, or like who are you reading and studying?
Well, it's kind of a hodgepodge, frankly. It's made, the term was coined by David Christian, an Australian scholar who was actually my PhD supervisor. But there are others in the field. Craig Benjamin is a big name. Eric Chaisson, who was the director of Center for Astrophysics at Harvard. He's the one that sort of has been, very prolific in publishing about these things. So and frankly, it's been a few years now since I was sort of in the scholarly sort of field. So I haven't really kept up with how it's. There was a moment where Bill Gates got involved and started, funding big scale, big history projects. But by that time, I had really sort of fallen out of favor with it. Not fallen out of favor, but I'm just not as interested in it as a scholarly discipline. As that wasn't why I was studying it. I was studying it more because I simply wanted to understand, my own experience of the world, which it was an amazing way to do. It was really an amazing way to do that. But as far as active research, I'm not really up on who's publishing at the moment, if anybody, frankly.
Okay, well, fair enough. Why did you come to find that that academic pursuit was inadequate? Like you said, you sort of lost the taste for it or something? I'm trying to get a sense of.
No, I got the sense that there was a lot of confusion over, what science was and where science ended in terms of like historical scholarship. There were a lot of historians that were getting involved. And as someone who had just come through the grist mill of the philosophy of science, it was like working with a bunch of kids in a candy store. Suddenly there was this sort of whole population of historians that could use scientific language, but weren't doing science, but they were using science in their investigations of history, which that's a noble and that is a just cause, but it just didn't have enough history in itself as a cohesive discipline to really hold my attention, other than as offering this amazing narrative, which is this infinite narrative of complexity. What the really cool thing is that it ties everything together. At the beginning, you're talking about the Big Bang, and you're talking about the cosmic microwave background radiation, and you're talking about the formation of stars and nucleosynthesis, and you're talking about supernovas and how supernovas lead to the formation of planets, and how stars and planets orbit each other, and how life can emerge, and how when life emerges and complexifies, specialized organisms can multicellular organisms can arise, and then mammals, primates, consciousness, art, economic politics. Suddenly, and that's what's the most fascinating thing about it. Is that it provides this cohesive narrative in which to sort of contextualize everything that we know. That's what really is so fascinating about it, which is one of the, we're starting to get into why I'm reaching out to you. It's because I want to take what you talk about and take what the communities of practice that you mingle with, and see if we can't map those things and map the meaning crisis onto this cosmic narrative? Can we somehow draw new insight, new wisdom toward everything that you're talking about from this big natural history? And I, everything that I know, everything that I have ever learned about the cosmic story, it is profoundly consistent with the things that I hear you talking about. And I want to interrogate that. I want to understand. So that's the proposal, is to and now I don't think we'll be able to, in this call, really walk step by step through that narrative, because it's a 13.8 billion year story.
Right.
Granted, a lot of that story is there's a whole period called the boring billions when nothing happened, but nothing in terms of no thresholds and complexity were crossed. But there are things that I have studied in the story of the universe that I think not always directly, and not always quickly, but show up in what you're talking about with some of the other, with Greg Enriquez and even Scott Jordan. These things that you're talking about have precursors. Right. Even when you're talking about the great philosophers, there's something that you're saying that I can hear the cosmic story unfolding in what you're saying.
That's powerful. That's very powerful.
Well, and I'd like to take that seriously. I'd like to see how this
taken seriously. Yeah, very much.
Well, okay. So in order to do that, I think the first sort of concept that we might sort of look at is this idea of ontological continuity.
Yes.
So maybe could you tell me what that means to you, that term?
So the version I get comes from 4E Cognitive Science, especially from Evan Thompson, who was probably the premier student, maybe even protege is the best word, of Varela. And so the idea there is that there's a deep continuity between the principles of cognition, perhaps consciousness, but let's just say cognition for now. Principles of cognition, that what makes us intelligent learners and problem solvers, and the principles of biology, both ontogenetically and phylogenetically. So to give one example, I would argue, and there's a lot of argument behind this, so I'm just gesturing at this argument, that a core feature of intelligence is this capacity for relevance realization, and that relevance realization is basically using principles very similar to how biological evolution works. It's introducing variation, then putting selective pressure on it. It's just doing that in a sort of a much more local and rapid timescale. But you can see that the principles of evolution by which we can explain the emergence of new species can also be used to explain the emergence of new solutions to problems, for example. And so you can there's a continuity between the principles you invoke to explain how cognition is working and the principles you invoke to explain how evolution is working. That's just one example, but the idea is there's a continuity. Now, the reason why continuity is used rather than identity is because identity is, and I think this is right, identity usually denotes a reductive explanatory strategy, whereby you say the upper level is completely explainable in terms of the lower level. And people have a sense of this when individuals say, love is nothing but chemistry in the brain. That's a reductive explanation. The point about invoking continuity is to say there is important identity of principle, but there are also important differences that point to emergence. And so that the upper level cognition really exists. It's not just chemical reactions. So what they're trying to do with deep continuity is get the idea of an identity of principles, but also a difference that is responsible to real emergence within the ontology. So that's how I understand ontological. And then the idea, of course, is that living things are autopoietic things. They have deep continuity with self-organizing systems that are not biological things. Again, that's not to say that biology can be reduced just to the chemistry, but there's important continuity. So that learning about how systems self-organize or autocatalytic, right, can help us understand the emergence of life. There's a continuity, there's similar principles, but it will also help to highlight, yeah, but what's new? Like, as you said, when we cross that threshold, what's the novelty that's now introduced in our ontology? So continuity is an attempt to say there's important identity between levels, but there's important emergence and novelty. There are thresholds that are also crossed. That's how I understand the proposal of deep continuity.
Okay, that I think that jives with what what I was thinking, but the version that really struck me when I was starting, when I was trying to come up with a research question and doing all my research, came from Eric Chaisson. Actually, he's the guy at the Smithsonian Astrophysics Center at Harvard, and this is the actual sort of paragraph that I took to. I'm taking it seriously. So let me just see if I can say it here. So it's he says, if we are to articulate a unified worldview for all complex systems observed throughout nature, then we must objectively and consistently model each of them identically. To restate once more for clarifying emphasis, which is not something that astronomers tend to do unless they mean it. To restate once more for clarifying emphasis, complex systems likely differ fundamentally not in kind, but only in degree. That is, degree of complexity manifesting ontological continuity. And so when I read that, the way I sort of interpret that is that, if you really want to have a deep and accurate, to the degree that you can, description of reality, then you must sort of model it as ontologically continuous. In other words, that reality is a continuum. So what he was doing was he was measuring energy density, so of energy as a function of complexity, and he looked at all these different phenomena in nature, and basically graphed them out. And when you put these graphs together with the actual narrative, the ontogenetic narrative of the universe, then what you see is that there is nothing to distinguish entities categorically, but only by degree of basically energy density, was what he was saying. So what he's saying is that everything that is on a continuum.
Yes. That
everything that we can observe in nature. And if you're going to say everything, what do you mean by nature? Because to me, nature means everything. What isn't nature? I haven't been able to discern that there's anything outside of nature, which I think, you hold a naturalistic, stance.
Yeah.
And so do I. So, and if we really take that seriously, then what it seems to me that he is saying is that everything is on a continuum. That goes for the fundamental forces at the beginning of the universe. It goes for the earliest atoms, the primordial sort of atoms that made the earliest molecules that converged into the first stars. And so the stars and the atoms and the fundamental forces are all on a continuum.
Sure.
And if those are on a continuum, then so are the planets. And if those are on a continuum, then so is the life that emerges on a planet. And if that's on a continuum, then so are we. We are on this continuum. And if we are on this continuum and we dream, or we have ideas, or we imagine futures, or we do politics, or whatever it is we do, all of these things are still on that continuum. And so that's what I took him to mean, is that if we are to really take it seriously, and all the evidence suggests that this is the case, then really, and this sort of is consistent with many of the kind of philosophical insights that I hear you talk about. Sure. that there are people like Whitehead, who I can't tell. I've generally speaking, I've forgotten all the philosophy that I've learned, but there are certain philosophical traditions that I think were sort of onto this, that we're
Sure.
onto this idea of continuity and process being this thing that, that sort of connects everything. And this is the thing too. It's like when I hear you speak with other scholars like Scott Jordan and
Yeah.
I hear so much convergence. I hear,
yeah.
I mean, just it's inescapable amounts of convergence. And so, I would call that also consilience, that there are, that people,
I think
all
so.
of these traditions are arriving at these insights that we barely have the language, barely have the concepts to describe and to put to language. But we've come from these disparate lines of inquiry, whether it's theology or philosophy, or now we see indigenous traditions and psychedelic stuff, and we see just wellness and mindfulness traditions, and Buddhist sort of things that are going on. They're all sort of pointing at this idea, which sounds a lot to me like ontological continuity. Mm-hmm. So something that's completely consistent with this, the purely scientific, not necessarily reductionist, but a purely rational scientific worldview, is showing up in all these other fields as well. And I think this is how one who just is committed to science can end up speaking in spiritual terms, because ontological continuity. That's why, because eventually, given enough investigation, we're going to discover that there are deep universal continuities that keep cropping up in the fossil record, but also in philosophy, and now in the blockchain, and everything else. These things are showing up. So I'm not sure if this is, if we can track this conversation or not, but so this is what I want to talk about. I want to talk about this as a practice. I want to talk about this as like
so let me make sure I'm understanding. You're saying that there's this deep convergence, which I agree with, which lends tremendous plausibility around ontological continuity, and you can see this from people in the Neoplatonic tradition, and Spinoza, Whitehead. You could see it in Greg Enriquez's work. You could write Evans' work, right? I totally. And then what I hear you say is, right? What I think is you want to turn it into a practice, meaning you want to. Well, I'm asking a question. Does this mean you want to enter into what is it to be in right relationship to this reality? Because there's one thing to have a theoretical statement about it, and then there's another thing to realize a correct or appropriate, a right relationship to it. Am I understanding you well?
Yes. And the reason that we're in the meaning crisis is that heretofore we have not really been in right relationship with it. Right. There was a time when we were still young, and and we were still living very close to nature, when we all could experience nature every day, that we held this. But then over time, by pure accidents of history, we have drifted away from it, and we've been struggling to sort of recreate it one way or another ever since. And this is sort of part and parcel of the meaning crisis that you describe. Sure. And so I think that if we can come back into right relationship in some way that is scientifically consistent, that is not derogatory of all these other traditions, that can sort of include them as valid and noble sort of attempts, that we can, in some sense, start to ameliorate the meaning crisis. Like there are, and what you call the meaning crisis, there are a million words for it. You could call it social enemy. I think it was Durkheim's enemy.
Enemy. Yeah.
The Anthropocene was was kind of the word that I used, because it came out of the environmental sciences. Yeah. Whatever you want to call it, that it's all sort of the same crisis. Yes. And it's a crisis of identity. And this is what puts it square in the lap of cognitive scientists, is that this is fundamental. All of our problems, essentially, I think, not all. I want to make this clear. I'm not a utopianist, and I am not naive. I am idealistic, but I'm not naive about this stuff. But what I'm saying is that at the root, if you dig deep enough to the facets of the meaning crisis, or the Anthropocene, or whatever you want to call it, you will get to these psychic accidents. You will get to these these fictions, these cognitive fictions that we hold and shape our identity. And deep down in there is a profound ameliorative revelation to be had. There's something here that will by default solve many of the perennial problems because it's working upstream of all of them.
That's a very exciting proposal. Say more. Let's keep going. That's fantastic.
Well, I mean, this is like an inescapable. This is just logic to me. Like that, if you truly think about if we really spend our time, plumbing what science has been able to reveal about the way the world is, at every turn, every chapter in that sort of scientific novel is saying what you're saying. When you talk about how consciousness, how cognition is this function of relevance realization, and how an organism is in sort of relationship with its environment, and it's seeking right relation, it's seeking what's relevant, which is really a function of relationship, right? I mean, relevance and relationship that's not just a coincidence that they are, like I do think that there's a deep relational intelligence, what I call ecological intelligence, that is sort of speaking to us through our cognitive capacities, through the way that our consciousness and our cognition has evolved, purely through biological, well understood dynamics of Darwinian evolution and molecular biology and blah 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 blah. We could go all the way down, but the point is that somewhere in there is this message, and I see the message everywhere, and I'm not talking about the gospel, I'm talking about this message of ontological continuity, of deep interconnectedness and interdependence of things.
Okay.
And so, and I just see that we have I listen a lot. I listen to podcasts, a lot. This is why I've devoted my life to this pursuit. And so I listen, and in every sort of popular podcast that's out there, I hear this, I hear a great frustration being voiced. I hear a great sort of crying out for something that can ameliorate. And the reason it's frustrating is because I'm like, here it is. Actually, it's right in front of us. We're immersed in this stuff. We've just created this. We've created this this artifice of that obscures it, and so and we've become sort of obsessed with this other fiction about who we are. And if we could just kind of remember this deeper sense of continuity that we have, that expresses itself in through our consciousness, by the way, like our consciousness isn't separate from natural history. Like consciousness is just another part of it's a profound part, but it's just another part of nature seeking to express and know itself,
Okay, so this is really, really cool. Sorry for interrupting, but I just want to be able to ask some questions.
Please.
You're eloquent, and so I tend to get swept up, and so that's beautiful. So, so there's three things I want to ask you about. So there's, you sound like a Neoplatonist, by the way, but saying remembering, and that consciousness actually participates in the deep structures of reality. But you said you want to turn this into a practice, and it sounds like it's a practice of remembering in some profound way. And this has something to do with what you're calling ecological intelligence, which seems to be something we participate in. It's not just subjectively projected from us, right? But we participate.
It's in the world. It's in the world, and because we are the world in the world, we are the world. Because we are in the world too, it's in us.
right. So the world and us let's use nature for the most encompassing term, like Spinoza does, and right, and then we'll use us and the world sort of the way we've done since the Enlightenment. The idea is that it's in the world and in us, but a better way of saying it is the world and us are both in it. Is that a better way of putting it? Like it points
is,
to more,
as long as you acknowledge that we are continuous with it. That
of course, that's what I meant. That's what I'm trying to get at, right?
Yeah.
So what is this practice of remembering, and what is it to what is it to remember this ecological intelligence? Like what does that, you in one sense you said it's all around us, but in another sense, right? Well, it seems to me like you're saying, but we have a cultural cognitive grammar that's thwarting us, misdirecting us. You've used the word fiction multiple times. It creates a fiction that keeps us from remembering. So like what is it that the practice is doing? Is it challenging the fictions? Is it getting us to sense the ecological intelligence? And then how does it do that? This is very exciting.
Well, it does it through narrative.
Okay.
This is the thing okay. So I assume that, we are deeply narrative creatures, like right. That we make meaning, and our consciousness is very much linked to our capacity to create these durable structures of experience, memory, that we call narratives. Like, so there are narratives about the world, narratives about pens that make it easy for us to sort of,
yes.
This is a pen. It's a thing that writes. It has ink at one end, and it's this invention of humans. And there's this whole narrative about that. We use narrative to make sense of the world, to make meaning of the world. And that's deeply one of our biggest, the greatest endowments that we have as a species, which is what sets us apart in many ways. So if we take that idea that narrative is just so ubiquitous and central to what we do, take that narrative capacity and look at the history of the universe with it. What is the story here? Well, the story is that there was from this mystery, a big bang happened. And then we can sort of piece together the story of how things came to be. And somewhere along the way, I forget what it is we were trying to, what is the practice of ecological intelligence? It starts there, that everything is related to everything, that nothing happens without relationship. Now, this is where I'm kind of forced to start talking about how the universe is built on relationship. Like if you look at I can't really do it deeply now, but if you look at the cosmic microwave background radiation, which is the earliest light that we see in the universe, we have a picture of it. We've taken it. There's no controversy here. We have this picture of the earliest light of the universe. And if you look at it, it's not uniform. It has little splotches of blue and green and yellow. It has different temperatures, different energy levels. It's not uniform, but it's those differences in temperature, those differences in energy density in the early space-time that presents the earliest, or some of the earliest, opportunities for there to be relationship.
Yes, very much.
That cosmic microwave background radiation evolved into the first stars, the first starry night. The cosmic microwave background radiation is a blueprint for the first starry night. Those stars formed in places where the energy was less, so that the hydrogen and helium could come together in such a way as to ignite the nuclear furnace. Stars ignite, nucleosynthesis starts. But the point is, if you were watching this thing happen, you'd see the first stars appear in the night sky, and suddenly there'd be this starry night. Well, that starry night evolved into later renditions of starry nights up until the one we have tonight. If you go out and look at it tonight, the starry night we see tonight is actually just a later version of earlier starry nights. So there's this, the point is, those relationships that were in the cosmic microwave background radiation, well, they're still playing out as relationships today in the stars that are in the sky tonight. Well, guess what, though? It's not just the relationships between stars that are derivative of that. Our relationships are derivative of that, because the Earth evolved as part of that system too. The relationship between the sun, our star, and the Earth is actually a relationship that was once has this lineage that goes all the way back to the cosmic microwave background. The point here is that all relationships are derivative of those primordial relationships. What I'm saying in here is that the universe creates through relational dynamics. If there's no relationship, there's no creativity. If there was no creativity, we wouldn't be here. And if the universe truly is ontologically continuous, then every relationship is a part of that evolving system. So the relationship between me and this pen is actually a lineage of the cosmic microwave the relationships that were originally in the cosmic microwave background radiation. This is how ecological intelligence becomes available, accessible. When you see, and this story is told like with all of the rigor that we can muster, we can tell this story. We know much of the details. And the whole scientific endeavor is really out to disprove this story, but it can't, because, so it's the best story we have, is that everything has evolved through these relational dynamics, and they're still evolving now. Every ecosystem that you encounter is on a continuum with those early, this is what ecological intelligence is. It's saying that creative capacity of these systems that are evolving is ecological, meaning it's relational.
Sure.
Now, once you know that, and once you know that you are a inextricable part of that, then you can see how that intelligence becomes available to you as an inextricable part of it, and that you can, in some sense, participate in that in intelligence, participate in that creativity, and suddenly you have a home. It's about being at home in this story, in this evolving universe.
This is beautiful. So let's slow down, and I want to expand that last move you made, because that ties it right back to Oika. You were like home, right? There's a sense in which we're getting homed. We're getting a cosmological or cosmic home again. And so,
yes.
So Rich, I want to ask you something, and this is not a circuitous criticism. I want to ask.
I want criticism. I want.
But I'm not offering one right yet. Okay.
I know ruthless critique.
And I promise, if I come up with one, I'll give you one. But right now, this is a clarification question, right? So I see a difference between you saying, like, there's something happening in the way you, like, grant me this. Somebody could write everything you said in a textbook. They're high school textbooks, blah, 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 and they do all that, right? And that it's not transformative of people, right? It's just something that
propositional. It's
right,
propositional.
exactly. And what I hear happening is there's a moment in the homing where it goes from being propositional to something other than propositional. And you're nodding, so I'm on the right track. So can you unpack that a little bit more? That's
well, it goes directly to participatory.
Right.
It's suddenly I'm a participant in this thing.
It really grounds participatory knowing in a deep, deep way. That's one of the things I'm hearing, right? There's ways in which. Go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I mean, participatory knowing is the knowing that results from how, me and the environment are co-shaped together. And that can be culturally co-shaped, it can be evolutionarily co-shaped, but now we're down to ontologically co-shaped, right? And this is the deepest grounding of participatory knowing, right?
Yes.
So the fact that both the planet and the planet and I together, I'm not trying to get too restrictive, right? But we're all affected by the sun's gravity and radiation, and so I'm being co-shaped. The planet, the environment, and me are all being co-shaped by these deeper ontological continuities. That's what I'm hearing you say. There's a way in which reality and let me play with words a little bit here. So I'm asking for a bit of generosity here. There's a way in which reality is realizing itself in the sense of, unfolding itself, actualizing itself, and the way I'm capable of realizing that in a cognitive sense. They're both being shaped at this participatory level to fit each other. Does that?
Well, has it ever been any other way? No.
Yeah.
It's just that we don't quite live like that's true. But
right.
I got news for you. It is true. Like that's an inescapable conclusion from everything we know scientifically.
Okay, so that, yeah, so I think we're in agreement. There's convergence here. There's a deep grounding of participatory knowing, how fundamental it is, how primordial, a word you used earlier, which is very good because it has good Heideggerian sense to it too. Meaning it goes into sort of the deep ontology that he talks about. So what do you mean then? That last thing you said was really crucial to me. We just don't live as if it's true. That seems to me to be a crucial thing.
Right, that's the fiction. That's the
Right.
inherited fiction. And this comes down to us through, the sages before us.
Right.
And we have all of these sort of diverging traditions that in one way or another sought to heal this divorce, this
Right.
sort of this separation of us. Now, by the way, so the way I just sort of pitched that to you was very cosmic in scale, which
Sure.
I know is hard to realize as a human being living, as an earthling. You can also realize it though simply on the earth. I mean, and I think it's also probably more appropriate and more important to just simply realize that we belong to the earth as opposed to the cosmos. I mean, if you're ready to really belong to the cosmos, there's plenty of fodder out there, to help you. But I think in the near term, the crisis that, faces us right now, which is ecological and planetary in scale, it's probably more appropriate just to simply understand how
So
deeply we belong to this planet.
Yeah, there's a pedagogical point. I get it. There's I tend to like big picture stuff. You do too. That's but I get your point. For many people,
but there's something more intimate about being from the earth and knowing that this logic applies to earthbound identity. It's and there's a deep intimacy to that we can experience. Like, we don't have to go to space. We don't have to look through a telescope to see this in action.
Sure. Now, the thing is, human beings are capable of nested homes, right? I have my home in Toronto, which is in Canada, which is on the earth. So you're not saying that these two senses have to be in opposition to each other, but just one is more intimately available and perhaps should be pursued first.
Yeah, because of the urgency of it. We are at a moment where the earth is really needing us to get our act together, and to remember this, and we don't need to get into it now, but I also happen to believe that many of the other perennial problems that we face will in some sense be addressed by default if we get this deeper identity sorted out. That many of the sort of psychopathologies that befall us because of our separation from the planet will, they are basically these other things like racism and economic injustice and absurd politics and all these other things. They are really just manifestations of this deeper sense of identity crisis.
Right. So, but interestingly, although we can, like the argument we've already run, sort of like strengthens the claim that this relationship to the earth, getting the right relationship to the earth is a fundamental relationship, a primordial relationship, right? So people may not need, that cosmic stuff, but the argument you've made about the big picture from science legitimates the claim. Look, this relationship, this getting into the right relationship with the earth is probably going to ameliorate a lot of the other psychopathologies, as you put them, or we call it psyche pathology in the new series that Greg and Gary and I
noticed that.
Right. That will address those. So I think that's a very interesting claim. So can you follow up on those, like the claim that this is more intimate for people? I think that's an important point. And then, like I said, you're right. We can't fully do it, but some idea of why you think addressing this will help to ameliorate a lot of the other things that are familiar features of the meta crisis.
Because of the sheer beauty and joy that being a part of this brings. It is a kind of, and the gratitude, like the sense of gratitude that is like this antidote to the grievance, this sense that once you hold this as something, you fall in love with the world.
Yes.
And that carries a lot of inertia into the way you interact with the world. Which means it carries inertia into the way you see yourself, the way you treat others, the way it also, I think it's this antidote to hyperconsumption. Like why are we constantly consuming? Well, it's to kind of, because we're grasping at ways to heal this hole in us. And so when you identify with the living earth and you see its complexity and you see it play out in the way that birds sing, or the way that water moves, or the way the wind sounds, or the way things smell, it enriches your life to such a degree that it makes so much of what we do, so much of the mistreatment and the suffering that we create, it makes these things irrelevant. Like they kind of go away. I'm no longer interested in violence. I'm no longer interested in materiality.
So three things, and again, you sound so much like Plotinus right now. It's really, and those are meant as compliments, by the way. Well, at least for me, they would be, right? So you mentioned beauty and joy and gratitude, and how it really reframes your salience landscape in just a profound way. So, nice. Right, you're not sort of struggling to give things up. I remember I often quote, St. Paul from the Bible, where he says, it's like, I used to be, when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put childish things behind me. He doesn't have to sort of resist, eating too much candy or playing with toys, or right, because he now has a totally different salience landscape. It's that kind of transformation, and the way that you invoked beauty and joy. So how do you, like, again, how do you go from and I understand, I now see sort of, I'm sort of foreseeing why art plays such a big role in what you're talking about in the project. At least it did in the link you sent me. It is, how do you go about, and I get it now, we're not just getting people convinced of propositions, we're trying to reawaken a sense of identity. In fact, you said a sense of identification that awakens in us the capacity to fall in love with the world, beauty, joy, gratitude. How do we do that?
Well, knowing the story is like, this is what, for me, I grew up as this kid, who was always outdoors, always getting scraped up and bruised and just out after dark, and, wild child, it ended up causing all kinds of, problems later on. But I was so having that formative time, in nature, I think is a big part of it, which we've largely lost.
Yes.
But the other way is through more intellectual endeavor, just knowing the story. We don't, and this is the thing where a lot of these other traditions didn't have the resolution, the depth of knowledge that we have, the fine-grained resolution knowledge of nature that we have about, like, the science, what science has revealed. Yes. So I guess to answer your question is, for me, that propositional knowledge about the way the world is built, the way that it has come to be the way it is, has always been, this exponential enhancer. It's been this amplifier of the participatory experience. Those two things have always sort of dovetailed and synergized with each other. I think that's just one way that I've done it, but it requires a lot of investigation. It requires a lot of study, of learning. It's think about, Humboldt was the last one who was said to be able to have known everything about the natural history. Yeah. So we need, I think we need some version of that. And I think that's what big history or deep history does, is it tells the story in a way that is just infinitely rich. And just the way that multicellular organisms came about, the way that life has emerged, abiogenesis, the origination of life and what was going on just before it is so relevant to when, an action, an activism, this idea, that consciousness is a function of a mind and a world, in conspiracy to create consciousness. Like that was going on prior to life. Like this idea that the world impinges itself onto materials, moving them around, putting them through gradients, and creating the conditions of, the conditions for life. Before those impulse, those sort of processes of the world, they bleed right into an action, like an activist thinking, and which shows how our version of that, our version of consciousness in its currently evolved state, is on this lineage that goes straight back to the prebiotic world. Like that there are things going on at atomic and material scales that then show up in consciousness, that show up in people's dream, imagination. They show up in the art. They show up. It's just like knowing stuff like that, like knowing the nuts and bolts facts, the scientific facts, did a great deal to like open me to that experience of that. That's really what I'm concerned with now, is what are the experiences? What is the phenomenology of this ontology? Like, if we take this stuff, if we take it seriously, and I take the science seriously, what is the lived experience of these, of this? Like,
and such that you get the beauty and the joy and the gratitude.
And the sense of belonging, Yes.
That's what I'm really hearing.
Yeah. And it doesn't go away. John, I've been at this for decades, and it's, I wake up every day, and it just doesn't fade. It only compounds. It only confirms itself. And I know there's confirmation bias. I know all that stuff, but I'm just saying, like, no matter how I interrogate this, no matter how I seek to disprove it, everything I learn confirms it, validates it, and propels it forward. Like, so what do you do with this? Like, and especially, what do you do with it when you watch the world around you suffering, falling apart, crying out for new things, crying out for new practices, crying out for new ways of relating to each other so that we don't self-annihilate. What do how do you, this is my great frustration, is how do I share this in a way that can be, in some small way, a part of responding to the meaning crisis?
Well, I mean, let me offer a suggestion then. I've been trying to get, the cog sci picture, and a fairly big history picture, not as deep as yours, but
no, but I see it as 100% consistent.
It is.
I see what you and Greg are talking about is it.
Yeah, I
there's
think
just
so.
there's some details, especially prebiotic details.
I agree. So what I meant was, so let's take it that we agree on that, because I think we do. What I meant was, part of what, and why I'm interested in Greg, and why I'm talking Greg's work, and I'm sorry, I'm interested not in just Greg's work. I'm interested also in Greg as a person. He's a friend, right?
You can tell.
He's an important person to me. I didn't want to make it sound like he's just a commodity, because that's part of the problem. But what I meant is, like, I've been talking about, ecologies of practices, and then communities of distributed cognition, collective intelligence. But I've always said that needs to be homed within a scientific worldview that properly legitimates the communities and the ecologies of practice. And I think what you're doing is offering that. You're saying, here's a way of taking the scientific worldview, and here's a way of framing it that would properly home the communities and the ecologies of practices. That's what I hear you saying. Yes.
It brings content. I see. And I don't mean this in a sort of, in a disparaging way, but all of the practices that I see out there, very few of them actually appeal directly to nature for
Yeah.
guidance, inspiration, energy, wisdom, whatever you want to call it. Some do, and that's beautiful.
Yeah.
But many don't. Many don't even really as a sort of as an ally. I think that's the kind of Oikos shaped hole that's in a lot of these practices. But what Oikos could do is contextualize all of them, give them a context to matter more in.
Yes.
Do you know what?
Yeah, it does. I mean, so there are people. I mean, you probably heard me talk to Rafe Kelly, and one of the core of his ecology practice is he takes people out and he does parkour in nature. Because he emphasizes the perspectival, procedural, participatory knowing within nature as sort of the core place, right?
I see that. Yeah.
Roy, the stuff she does, where she has people come on basically to a situation and they're interacting with forces, and they're doing this really kind of primordial kind of communing with non-human organisms as a profound. So I there is that that growing recognition. And so I think that what you're doing, first of all, is valuable for pointing out that there's a centrality to what they're saying. Give me a sec. There's a centrality to practices within and with nature that should be given more priority within ecologies of practices. That's one of the things I think what you're arguing for would point. Like you're right, many ecologies of practices don't have the involvement with the natural world as an essential feature. And it seems like, given your argument, that's something that should be addressed. And I think some people, Juanita and Rafe come easily to mind, have at least intuitively seen that and have trying to put that as a priority.
But I also think that it would apply to things that we would not normally think of as ready. For example, Catholicism, straight up religion, the religious doctrine. There is a place for those things in this story too. This can validate. It can validate. It can heal the. It's like science is actually confirming the religious insight. So
I agree, and I think there's a whole. I think there's a whole important. I'm not. But what I want to. I agree, and I mean I've made these arguments that I think you can see a lot of the functionality of religion when it's operating adaptively as trying to get us to fall in love with being again in a profound way. But I do think. I'm trying to pick up on this sense of the intimacy with the earth that you talked about. And that I think, well, maybe you're not saying this, but one of the things I'm taking from this is there needs to be practices in which that's a little bit more explicit and focal. Like, there's like the sense sitting that people do, which is a very interesting practice. You go out in nature and you basically, instead of meditating inward, you sort of open yourself up receptively to what's going on around you. Things like that sound like
I sometimes avoid the idea of meditation. It's much more about contemplation, but I bring it one step further and say it's contemplation. Like play. There's a play.
Excellent. Oh,
like you really do have to engage in a kind of imaginal play.
Yes.
For example, one of the things I use a hammock a lot, like just a regular old hammock. And the reason is because, I'll just say this briefly, this is one of the practices, is that, you have this hammock, you're walking through the woods, you're looking for a place to hang it up. What you need to find are two trees in the right relationship. So you have to kind of get yourself into a relational state of mind, looking for the relationship, right? And then when you get it and when you find it, you've got to put the hammock literally in the relationship between those two trees. Those trees are in an ongoing relationship. And so you enter into that relational space physically and you get into the hammock. And then there are all these practices that you can do, like we call radical affection is one, where you sort of conjure up this sense of affection and you project it out into the tree and wait to see what comes back. And what you end up getting back is, I won't spoil but so I think that, there are practices and practices. There's just so many little things that we can, little contemplations that we can do.
That's cool.
To to ritualize and to
Yep.
to just to embody these things.
No, I think ritual is fine. I just released my the link to the talk I gave at Cambridge about imaginal serious play and ritual, and that's exactly what you're talking about. And I could see why these would be so transformative, people. And so, like, do you like? You basically are offering people a course where they come and they learn to, like you said, it's a way of being, a way of seeing, a way of being. How do you help people get into this way of seeing and being?
Well, I do have a course. I have, I have developed a course. It's free. My work is I'm lucky enough to have some funding, a philanthropic source, but so I've created this course that tells the story of the universe in through chapters, and it just tells it in a way that highlights how everything is relational. And I've adapted that. Been working with a lot of artists. It's strange that I would sort of find this affinity with artists, because as it's, coming up through the sort of scientific grist mill, I was never asked to or encouraged to do anything with art. And so I didn't. And then just in the last couple of years, I've discovered that there is this incredible community, this incredible population of people out there that are deeply sensitive and deeply creative, who also don't really know any of the science, because like me, they weren't asked to, really engage with the science because they took an artistic professional route. And so we've sort of found each other out there, and there's this emerging community of practice of artists who are willing to take their sensitivities, learn the language that I can give them, like learn the story of the universe, see how their creative practice is actually an extension of nature's creativity. And once they sort of tap into that alliance, they can bring it to the work, they can bring it to their art, which means that the ecological intelligence ends up getting embedded in the art. If it gets into the artist, it gets into the art. If it gets into the art, it gets into the culture. So that's the kind of like methodology that I've been playing with a lot lately. But otherwise, for me, I really don't have anything to sell, like I'm not.
No, I didn't think you did. Yeah.
But I am on this sort of ongoing pilgrimage to and I'm actually starting to work with scientific field stations. Back in the day when I was doing ecological research, there's this whole network of field stations that are just out there. They're the places that scientists go to do field work. And so I've been sort of slowly bringing artists into that world and giving them access to these habitats.
Excellent.
Yeah, as a way of, and then it becomes a collaboration between art and science. The science can sort of inform the art, but the art can then really blow up the experience of place, of nature. And so we've been working, that's something that's sort of been unfolding in the last 6 or 8 months. So I forget why I was telling you that. I think it was because you asked me, how do you bring people
how do you help people into this way of being, like what practices do you give them, what kinds of knowledge do you give them, what kind of, a lot of people.
I find that it's a long process, John, to I could teach a course, I could give a workshop, I can, we can do these practices, but the most fruitful ones, the ones that have the real sort of magic, are the ones that become relationships with friendships and co-creative projects.
Apprenticeship and fellowship are really
and it's two-way. I've learned so much from working with these artists. They I just get to see the world totally differently, and it brings an energy to the whole thing. And that's so I don't have a formal sort of offering other than if anyone wants, if this is interesting to anyone, they just got to seek me out. And I've started doing podcasts. I hope to do more of those. But really, it's about when people are ready, they'll find this. They've got to be ready to receive the gift, frankly, and that's how it works. That's the best way, I think.
Well, that seems like a good place to close our first discussion. I foresee that we are going to have others. I hope you'll come back again on Voices with Vervaeke, because this has been really.
I hope so.
Really
I think it would be great to like, what I kind of, a sort of fantasy of mine would be to go through the different thresholds of cosmic evolution and draw out all of the wisdoms, all of the insights, and talk about the practices.
That'd be great. I would like to do that. So let's set that up to do that. I think that's an excellent thing to do.
Yeah.
So I'll ask Rich to give some links. So those of you who want to take up his very generous invitation can reach him, can talk to him. And I'm promising those of you who are interested, he's definitely going to be on, if he wishes, he's definitely going to be on Voices with Vervaeke again. Which you did a lot to embody the beauty and the joy that I think will ultimately be the things that most persuasive for people. So it's been really, really wonderful. And I always like to give people, or my guests, sort of, the last chance, the last word. Any brief sort of final thing you want to say?
I guess just know that this is out there, that, when you feel like despair, when you feel that the world is broken, you're right, it is broken, but like there is hope. And I know my opinion isn't worth anything at this moment, but in my opinion, there's reason for hope. And I can actually see that hope. And if I can see it, maybe you can see it. And that, there is a way that humanity can transition. That is the name of the game. We've always done that, and we still can do it. And it might seem overwhelming and it might seem intimidating, but actually when you really allow yourself, you discover that this is a beautiful, and it's a beautiful opportunity. It's not just a crisis, it's an opportunity. And that's it. We can do this. We kind of have to do this, and there are ways to do it. And so keep looking.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you.